Okay, so Tonya, thank you so much for joining me to talk about fixing your feet. Um, I have an old edition here, and I know this isn't yours.
Yes.
But I've had this for many, many years, and many ultra runners in the UK. This is about a Bible for the moment they do anything long. So I'm very excited to talk to you. Tell me a little bit about how you get to co-write the latest edition. Is it edition 7? Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
From what we've just been talking about, as in you started out with horses. How did you end out on human feet, which are much worse?
sorry, my dog.
Oh,
Um, I've got a
let me
German
see.
Shepherd.
Hello.
Honey.
Oh, lovely. It's beautiful.
Oh, she's a good dog. She's
Oh,
2 years old. That's Miss Alvy. So fun fact on the 6th edition. This is where I can have. Those are my.
it's your foot, isn't it?
That's my foot and my hands. So technically, I'm a cover model.
Yay! You made it.
My
Send your
friends joke,
autograph.
is that on your CV or you on your resume? I'm like, yeah, sure. Um, so um, so this is the 7th edition, and I just really highly recommend that people upgrade to the 7th edition. Because John Von Hoff is he's such an amazing human being. He has like a researcher's mind, and he was running ultras back in the old days, like, Western States 100. It's the first 100 miler. I don't know if the story is that the origin story is that 1973, Gordy Onsley, who was a kind of a chiropractor who lived in like the Auburn, California area. His horse went lame and his girlfriend broke up with him. And so he decided, instead of riding the 100-mile Tevis Cup horse endurance ride, he decided to run it. And so then that, that was in the 70s, and the boom of running. And so John Von Hoff started running. He was running ultras in the 80s, and he just had foot care issues, and he noticed that other runners, the foot issues was preventing them from being able to do the things that they wanted to do. And so he just has this mindset, and he kind of invented foot care as a thing. And
Mm.
he self-published the first edition. So this is 7 editions, and he redoes it. It's a new edition about every 5 years. So this back in the 80s, that he self-published his first edition of Fixing Your Feet. So then fast forward to my living in the Pacific Northwest, and I went down to Western States 100 with a bunch of friends of mine. Some were running, some were volunteer. I asked a friend of mine, I said, hey, where should I volunteer? And he said, oh, you need to go volunteer with John Von Hoff at Michigan Bluff, which is at mile 55 at the Western States 100. And it's actually the largest aid station, the largest medical station. It's like the first big medical aid station that the runners have access to. They've already run up in the high country and then down through the canyons, and then they come up into Michigan Bluff, and they have varying degrees of foot situations. And so I started working with John in 2010 at Michigan Bluff. And so he's just been 2010. And we just hit it off immediately, because I grew up with horses, no hoof, no horse. And so I've just always had a strong interest in feet and foot care. And then as a physical therapist, when I was in PT school, I did a clinical with a foot ankle specialist. So that's just always been, and I trace it back to the horses. But I worked side by side with John for, at Michigan Bluff for years. He just retired a few years ago. He moved to Tennessee, so now he hasn't been to States in like 4 years. But but he just became like a mentor and a really good friend of mine. And he invited me to be a part of this this latest edition. And so what we did is there are 77 pages of additional content in this edition. So I highly recommend it. And then I've also have some videos and videos that you all can access that show like basic taping techniques. Because if there's something that I want to improve on for the next one is to have more visuals in here. And I think that's definitely something we need to do better. But anyhow, that's a little bit of my origin story and kind of where the foot care stuff comes in. But yeah, this is 77 extra pages.
Okay, cool. So I suppose where you are and where I am, I live in the middle of the UK where it is wet all the time.
Mhm.
And so we are polar opposites in terms of terrain and temperatures. What sort of differences are there in the sort of foot care you have to have between a sort of hot, dry race and a cold, wet race?
Well, so interestingly enough, is I spent a bunch of years out in Oregon and Washington, the Pacific Northwest. And so I am very familiar with just that. In fact, I had to give up on my lifelong dream of moving to Portland, Oregon, because I was on the west side, the rainy side of the Cascade Mountain Range. And I realized I can't do it. I can't do that gray raininess. So I've definitely experienced the gray, rain, mud every day, cold temperatures, like that 50-degree Fahrenheit, kind of 45, 50, which is just kind of the daily kind of gut it out. So really the biggest difference, there's the longer you're out the longer you're running, the more moisture and wetness is a thing. One of the things that people don't appreciate or are not aware of is regardless of the external conditions, whether it's dry and you're running through the desert or whether it's wet and you're running through muck and mud, your feet, each foot has roughly 125,000 sweat glands. So your feet are actually the largest contributor to the wetness of your foot skin than anything else. And so the biggest cause for skin breakdown on the feet is that prolonged exposure to wetness, which is the term is maceration, and it's kind of like when your fingers get pruny when you're like in prolonged water. And then what happens is that skin just gets more friable or more fragile, and it tends to break down, and there's different things kind of happen as a result of that. So I think the biggest difference is when you're in muddy, wet terrain, such as where you live, and versus like a dry terrain, like it was somebody's living in the desert, is you have to do the math. The length of time you're going to be out there is probably the biggest math to be doing. If you It's less about the conditions and more about what you've trained in. If you've trained in muddy conditions, your feet are accustomed to muddy, wet conditions. The skin and your feet are accustomed to them. If you've trained in the desert conditions, the drier conditions, your feet are going to be more accustomed to them. Because like in a desert, you're going to be thinking a little bit more friction because of the dirt, the dry dirt that kind of gets into the shoes. And so you're going to do a little bit more, you're going to be considering more of a friction kind of reduction in addition to being mindful of the maceration as compared to being in a wet, muddy conditions. But it depends on how deep the mud is and all that. But I don't know, that's kind of a long answer, short question, but I think the longer you're out there, no matter the conditions, your feet are making your feet wet.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I suppose on the hot conditions, the moisture's coming more solely from, no pun intended, from your foot.
Yep.
Whereas in our conditions, it's probably more externally. But I suppose you have to deal with it in the same way.
Yeah, and the beauty of training in those conditions, if you live in those conditions, your feet are become acclimated to them, to
Mm,
the wet conditions. And so your feet have a little bit more, they're more robust and able to handle it. It's I think one of the things like if I can get runners to make decisions regarding their foot care, especially for the longer events, more than like 6 hours, is to be more critically thinking and have strategies that they can adapt, like have basic supplies with them at all time. You should always have just the basic foot care supplies with you that are available, even if you've never had any trouble during training.
yeah.
And then just like your hydration and nutrition strategies, if you're running a longer race, especially, you have strategy A through Z. Like, you know what, if this hydration stuff isn't working or my stomach starts getting upset, you adjust, you modify on the fly. Like that you should have some similar thinking with regard to your foot care.
Okay.
Instead of just like I do the one thing and the one thing only, and then you're in the middle of a race and you have something that happens that hasn't happened before and you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of hosed.
Yeah. Okay. Are there some best practices people need to remember sort of to prepare for a race? I hear that you need to soften your feet. Is that right?
So best practices. So preventive practices would be so calluses are something that you need to be mindful of. And the general rule of thumb is to reduce the callus. Uh, because that is an area, the callus is formed because that's an area of friction by just the way that you move. We all move differently, and the way your feet are built, the way you move, just the terrain you're on. And so that callus forms because there's continuous friction there. The problem is if you're going to be out longer than what you typically train, which is like for more of an endurance race, because the skin gets more fragile as the longer you're out there, because the skin's just exposed to sweat and the wetness, then that callus can actually start moving on the skin underneath. And that can become, so it's not, because when the callus is forming, it's basically the outside skin is rubbing on whatever it's rubbing on. But when you have during a longer race and that skin is more sensitive, like when your skin gets pruny, it tends to be more what's the word, like it's not slippery anymore. And so then what happens is that callus starts to actually move. The callus moves on the dermis, or the skin underneath where the nerves and blood vessels are, and then you end up with a deep blood blister
Okay.
instead of just an external epidermis, which is where that's the top layer of your skin where there's no blood vessels. The epidermis is where the callus is located. But if you end up running longer, and you have more maceration and different things happening, that blood blister is really painful, because it's formed where the dermis is, where the nerves and blood vessels are. And now you have a more painful situation. So a lot of people really feel like their calluses are protective. They're protective during training, while you're doing the length of training that you normally are doing. But if you're going to do a race that's longer than your training runs, be mindful of that creating a blood blister that a callus can cause. So that would be, so callus management is a preventive strategy. And then here's the big one, and this is John's absolute soapbox, is toenail care. A lot of ultra runners or runners in general think that losing your toenails is just a part of running. And that is absolutely not the case.
Okay.
So we've got two things that'll happen, and I have a whole toenail video that you can watch. Two things that happen with toenails that cause issues while people are running. So you'll have a toenail if it's too long,
Mm.
or if it's too short, or if it's curved. If a toenail is curved, what can happen is, let's see, I know it's my finger. I got man hands. If the toenail is curved, those edges can poke into the skin by the nail bed, and then that can become like an abscess, or it can become an area of tissue injury. So
Mm.
you want to have toenails that are flat across the top and not extending past, you really don't want to see more than a quarter inch of white. And then here's the big one. And one of the biggest reasons of why people lose their toenails is filing the end of the toenail down from the base to the tip, so that when you run your finger from the tip to the base, you don't have a leading edge that catches on anything. So if you file that leading edge down from the base to the tip, you're going to thin out the toenail at the end of it, so then it's more pliable, but then it's also thin enough that it doesn't catch on anything. Because usually what's happening is it's not generally, the toenail is not generally catching on the inside of the shoe. It's usually the sock. And it has to do, actually, as a physical therapist, it has to do with the range of motion in your toe and your ankle that put the toe at risk for that sock just catching on the end of the toenail. And with
Oh,
every
wow.
stride, if the sock is catching on the end of the toenail, with every stride, it's lifting that toenail up a little bit, lifting it up a little bit. And over time, then it pulls that toenail up off of the nail bed. You get a blister underneath, a blood blister more often, or it's cramming it down into the base. So if you just pay a little bit of attention to toenail care and callus care the week before the race, because sometimes people can get a little aggressive. The week before the race, that can really save a lot of trouble for people.
Oh, fascinating. I never knew that. I mean, I always thought that the loss of toenails was due to your feet bumping against the end of the shoe. And yeah, if your toenails were too long and it was your toenail that hit the end of the shoe rather than the actual end of your toe, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it can be hitting. Now, if you're doing like fell running and you're doing a lot of downhill running and your technique isn't that, if your foot's on the ground too long, your foot will slide in the shoe and hit the ends.
Mm.
Ideally, if your downhill form is proper, is good, and your feet aren't on the ground for very long, your foot doesn't have a chance to slide forward. But yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I've learned over the years is it's the catching of the sock on the end of the end of the nail, and it
Mm.
has to do with decreased range of motion in the ankle and the big toe, usually specifically.
Right.
So I know, sounds crazy, but it's all
Yeah.
connected.
Is
Yeah.
there something we should be doing with our ankle movement then, or?
All runners, here's my thing. All runners, so we all brush our teeth twice a day, right? I mean, we should. And you stand there, some people walk around. I think that if runners could do one thing to help themselves is do heel raises while you're brushing your teeth. And
Mhm.
if you do heel raises off of an elevated surface, so like, okay, we used to have phone books, I'm dating myself, but like something, and it depends on the range that you have available for your ankle. So you want to put your foot like up to past the ball of the foot. You want it to be like midfoot on a yoga block or a 2x4 or something, that when you go all the way down, that you feel a stretch in the back of your calf, but it's not something that's uncomfortable. And so
Mhm.
you want to just kind of be a little bit at that end range, and then do heel raises, like go all the way up on your tippy toes and then lower all the way down, in that, as some people call that, like negative space, so that your toes are coming up
Mhm.
and your ankle is flexing up. And so then it really increases that ankle range of motion, but then it also increases the tissues on the back of the leg, the lower leg, the ankle, calf, the calf muscles and the plantar fascia all contribute to how the toes move when you're running. And so if you have limited ankle motion upwards, then what happens is the toe ends up coming upwards because that motion's not coming from the ankle the way that it's supposed to. And here's kind of a nerdy thing I learned like a long time ago when I was a PT, and it comes from being a horse person. You watch how people and things move. You can tell if somebody's wearing sandals, if they have limited ankle range of motion. When they walk, their big toe will come up. It's
I've
just a nerd.
noticed that. Yeah.
So your big toe, think about it. If your big toe is coming up every time you take a step because your ankle doesn't move enough, then that's a source of the catch. Then your toenails catching on that sock.
Gonna
And
be.
so do heel raises while you're brushing your teeth.
Oh, oh, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. I
Yeah.
didn't know that at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. And
These
so
are very
here's the nerd thing that I've noticed. Like I live in Florida now,
yeah.
and so Florida, it's flat. There are no mountains, there's no hills. So I've noticed a problem with I've noticed more runners have issues with ankle range of motion and
Mhm.
toe range of motion, like the ball of their foot. They have issues with blisters, deep blisters on the ball of the foot. And it's because when you're running up a hill, you naturally have to stretch, it naturally stretches the foot and the back of and your calves. But when you're running on the flats all the time, you don't have that stretching happening. And so people's range of motion, just anecdotally of what I've seen with runners here I've seen that condition happening a great deal more than when I've lived where there's mountains.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. Oh my
Right?
God.
I know,
I,
it's super nerdy.
I mean, is there the equivalent for the mountain runners then? Do you see a particular issue rising from people that always race in the mountains?
So people who, if they're spending a great deal of time doing a lot of climbing, they're going to have, and like, think about it, your hip flexors and your quads, especially there's one quadricep, the thigh muscle it crosses both your hip and your knee. That one will be more shortened. So people kind of, as they get older and with our lifestyles, we tend to sit a lot more. But I see people who are spending a lot of time running up hills, they're spending a lot of time with their torso tipped forward and their hips are partially flexed. And so those muscles are also the power muscles. They're if they're overusing their quads to get up the hill rather than their glutes, because your butt muscles, your gluteal muscles, they're actually built to extend your hip. So when you're running up a hill, your form should be such that your glutes are creating the power, not the quads dragging you up the hill.
Mm.
That's a whole, that's kind of a whole conversation right there. But yeah, definitely, if you're running up the hill a lot, you're gonna have adaptively more short hip flexors and quads.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So just
Oh.
know the conditions you're in is critical.
And taping. Now I know, I mean, I've heard, I've never had to do it, thankfully. Oh, I tape my little toes and like a bit with the soft tape, but I mean, I've seen some really like duct tape being put on feet and some really just stuff I've just gone, whoa, really. I mean, you must have seen some stuff in your time as well. What can you recommend on the taping front? And do you know, should people be taping before they even start, or is it a measure that they should be using to react to a scenario?
Well, ideally, we're in a prevention mindset
Okay.
because once tissue is damaged, it's damaged, and now you're just going to be mitigating that damage for the rest of your race. So ideally, we're as preventive as possible. Unfortunately, and if we do react to something during a race, you react quickly, because never in the history of a blister has one ever gotten better the
It's never
longer
gone
you
away.
like, it's not going away. Come on, people.
Hey, it went, it's okay.
It's only going to get worse, and you're going to have more of an issue to deal with. And so here's a couple of things, and especially, folks who've been, here's that disconnect. Like there's all the products that you use for your hydration and for your nutrition. Like the science has contributed to people using different things, and it's the science behind the things that people are using for their hydration and nutrition while they're running is super advanced, and people have had, for the most part, not a problem with advancing and adjusting to the newer science and more technologically advanced things. What's the word I'm looking for? The advancements. They're not like opposed to the advancements. What I find with foot care is like there's all these advancements in materials and supplies that you're using, but people are just not interested, and that's the cause of significant problems. Vaseline at one point was the only option for friction control and staving off of maceration. It is now the absolute last thing. It would be the absolute last ditch effort, last ditch. If you got nothing left to use, then I guess you have to use Vaseline, because there are so many better products. The same with duct tape. At one point, duct tape was the only option. Now it is far inferior because of a whole lot of different things. Like now we have, so duct tape, there's a tape called Leuco tape, which is, it's the duct tape of the new millennia. It does not have any stretch at all in it, but it has a really strong adhesive, but it doesn't have that strong, glumpy, just occlusive, like just the duct tape ends up, what happens if you use it on the feet, the adhesive melts. And then because the tape doesn't bend very well, then it slides around and you get this whole big glump of stuff. And then usually people are using Vaseline. So there are better options. So update your options. Leuco tape is for things where, because it doesn't have any stretch at all with it, that's a nice thing to have in your bag to create some support. Like a strip of Leuco tape goes a long way. Like let's say you turn your ankle while you're out on the trail. That's a really good something that we can just strap that on there and provide some support to those injured tissues, that injured ligament. But Leuco doesn't do very well on the toes because it doesn't have any stretch at all. And you have to really have to have some kind of advanced techniques. And if you put Leuco tape on tissue that's already damaged, because of that strong adhesive, and the way that because the tape doesn't stretch, it's going to shift around and can cause more tissue damage once you put it on damaged tissue. Leuco works really well for preventive and for multi-day races to prevent issues, like especially on the ball of the foot and along the back of the heel, or even up the Achilles. That is something that when I've worked with multi-day events, though, those runners are like, Leuco is the thing, because you set it and forget it. That'll stay on for a couple of days. And so you need to know like the event that you're going to be in. If you're going to do a multi-day event, prevention is absolutely critical. And you may pre-tape areas that you've never had any trouble with in the past. And so it's kind of it depends sort of answer to your question. Using that kinesiology tape is generally the best tape to use for anything on the foot, because it's stretchy lengthwise, but not widthwise. And so it's really forgiving for the techniques that you use. If you put a piece of kinesiology tape on the toe and or the ball of the foot and there's a little wrinkle, you don't have to take the tape off. You can just pinch, you can just cut that little wrinkle. You just pinch, what you do is you pinch the edges of the wrinkle together and then just cut
Okay. Yeah.
that little ear, and then the tape is forgiving enough that those edges will stay together and you won't have a problem. The integrity of the tape job will stay. Whereas with the Luco tape, if you do that, then the tape, you'll have a separation in those edges because you don't have the stretch. It doesn't have the stretch to it. So
Yeah.
to answer, the prevention is critical, and how you need to prevent depends on issues that you've had during training or previous races. That's all information. Sometimes things will just come up that you've never had happen before, and then that's a learning opportunity. And then, so let's say, you're running a 50-mile race on terrain that has a fair amount of climb, a fair amount of descent, and you generally train on flats, and you notice a blister on like your outside of your right heel. Now and that you address it during that race. Now that when you are on hilly terrain, that you tend to get a blister on the outside of that right heel. So then you would prevent that by pre-taping that area if you know that it had an issue before, if you've never had an issue. And so you kind of look at the terrain, you look at how you've trained and what your body is accustomed to, and kind of do that sort of math, and then use products that are actually advanced and in this new millennia.
Yeah, I don't know what the differences are between the US and the UK in terms of products. I'll have to go off and do some research.
Yeah, there are some similarities as far as like, I mean, Amazon's available. Amazon's Amazon. Like, I have worked with people in the UK, and you can definitely find the kinesiology tape.
Oh
You
yeah,
can, yeah,
we
you
live on it.
know, yeah, preventing the maceration, using some type of a hydrophobic layer, like the like blue steel is something that's actually made in Australia. So I think it's a little more common
Uh,
in America,
uh,
but that's where knowing the ingredients in the products can be really helpful, and the properties of the different ingredients is helpful.
oh, okay. Yeah, I use something called Body Glide.
Oh, yeah, Body
Yeah,
Glide. So yeah, and that works for reducing friction. The
everywhere.
main ingredient, the main ingredient in Body Glide is petroleum, and that's like kind of what Vaseline is made out of, and so that reduces friction. It doesn't last as long as something that has more robust ingredients, and it's a little bit more of an emollient, like it softens the skin and reduces friction. And so that'll last for that does really well, like more for friction for like, your bra strap or, different
Mm,
parts of your body.
yeah.
And the for shorter races, there's let's see, there's something we have, I think the most robust product that I'll recommend to folks is something that's called Salty Britches. And I've discovered it here in Florida because it's so humid here.
Yeah.
It's lanolin based, and so just knowing the ingredients, like petrolatum is more of an emollient and more anti-friction. It's less of a hydrophobic layer that protects. It's not going to protect against the starting of maceration, like where your skin gets waterlogged. It's just a matter of time. It will happen to anyone,
Okay.
just eventually. And so like something like Salty Britches, it's lanolin based. Lanolin is I mean, that's a natural, it's what's on sheep's fur, sheep's
Uh,
wool. So that's not only is it an emollient where it softens the tissue and moisturizes the tissue, but it has a really strong hydrophobic properties.
uh,
So yeah, so if you're that's a natural ingredient that really is head and shoulders above like a petrolatum. But
okay.
petrolatum is it's a cheaper binder. And so if generally if like petrolatum is like the #1 ingredient, I'm like, oh, this will work for like less extreme conditions and for shorter periods of time, like 6 hours or so. And so kind of queuing myself up to like something that I forget to I've forgotten to clarify historically is people will say, oh, I ran a 100-mile race or 50-mile race or 50K race or something, like, oh, I chain my shoes and socks all the time. And I'm like, changing your shoes and socks during an event is important, but you're not keeping your feet dry. That's not what's happening. You should time your sock and shoe changes with two things: the life of the hydrophobic layer that you have on your feet.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
know that your salty britches or trail toes or blue steel, I think those are kind of the ones I recommend the most. If you know that that starts wearing off at about 6 hours, then you want to change your sock at like 5 hours. Or you want to change your shoes and socks after a water crossing. So
Okay.
when you know your feet are going to get soaked. And
Yeah.
so if doing something longer, there's a powder called Blister Shield powder that you all can get that it has all the things in it. It has PTFE, which is basically Teflon. So it reduces the coefficient of friction and makes things really slippery. And so it reduces friction and shearing. And then it also has PE, which is like a polyethylene wax, which is a really strong hydrophobic layer. So it's waterproof and it really repels water from the skin on your feet. And so what I love about the powder is you can have that preloaded into your socks in your drop bag. So
Ah,
one less thing to dick around with when you're at the aid station. Smearing a bunch of cream and goo on your feet is the last thing you need to be worrying about, or your crew even. Yes, you can put a glove on, but that just, you don't, it's not, use the ointments and the creams for the shorter stuff
mm,
for when you start, but then if it's a longer race, then just have that preloaded and you're dialed, you know?
okay.
Yeah, and it really, and it's double duty. And what's great about that powder too is if at some point you do need to apply tape, it's less likely to interfere with the tape's adhesive because
Ah,
it's not going to wiggle underneath the tape. Like if you've already
good.
got, if you put cream,
Yeah.
is then ointment's going to kind of migrate underneath the tape. But anyhow, so, and then, yeah, I could talk about this. I could talk
My
about
God.
products ever.
I know. I mean,
Day.
it's amazing. I mean, there isn't a single thing you said to me this evening that I knew before I talked to you, and so there's just so much. Uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm assuming all of this is in your book.
It's in the book.
All this
Definitely in the
information.
book.
I mean, I know we're going
Yeah.
to be very kind and share all the links anyway, but it's in the book. So
Mhm. And I have some videos I've made that have the basic techniques, foot care techniques, like how to tape and that kind of thing. And then I also have a list of the supplies that I recommend and that I have found to be the most helpful for people. And so, like taping techniques, I definitely cover this in the video. Something that people miss is putting down like an adhesive layer before you put the tape on. And
mm,
so in the medical world, tincture of benzoin is a thing that you put on if you're going to put like adhesive on a piece of tape on somebody's skin and you want that to stay on. So whether it's like a tube that goes up somebody's nose or if it's a tube that's in their mouth, and they want to hold it still, or like an ostomy bag. They'll put a pre-adhesive on there and then put the tape, and that tape will stay longer. So
Okay.
tincture of benzoin has been the thing that we've recommended now for decades. Like John's been doing this, since the 80s, John Von Hoff. The last couple years, the tincture of benzoin has become really difficult to find. So I'm no longer recommending it. And
Okay.
that's the only thing that a correction I need to make for my videos. I'll have to refilm the one where I talk about foot care supplies. So mastisol is the thing that's used in the medical setting, and it has some advanced ingredients in it, and that stuff really gets sticky, and that keeps the tape on really, really well. And then something called skin tack is something that has been used, I think historically it's used like in athletics, and it's like it has some of the similar ingredients as pre-taping, like if you've ever, like, when people do the athletic taping during like I guess you would call it football, but like whatever athletic kind of stuff it is. And so
Yeah.
with the taping, it's really important to look at my videos, because wrapping tape around a toe is not as effective as going up and over and side to side, which is kind of what we show for in the videos. And that's sort of what John kind of created as specific taping techniques. If you go from the bottom underneath the toe where the toe attaches to the foot, from a strip of tape that's a little bit wider than the width of the toe, from the bottom all the way to the top to where the toe attaches to the foot. And then a second strip from the inside. I do inside to outside because I'm right-handed. I don't think there's really a reason. Somebody asked me that. And then just the same thing, another strip inside to outside. And that means the seams are going to be not in an area where there's going to be any friction or rubbing.
They're parallel to the toes.
Yeah, it's going to be along, and it's going to be in areas that are like kind of obtuse in where the toe is, at non-rubbing areas. And then just the way that the toe moves in the shoe, if that tape is lengthwise, and because it has a little bit of stretch to it, it's not going to move. If the tape is around the toe circumferentially, you have these ridges, and then as you move, that tape's just going to be, as your foot slides a little bit in the shoe, the foot typically slides forward and back, then it just moves the tape, and then it glumps up and becomes a whole big mess.
Okay.
So those are the techniques. I think the other like soapbox that I have is those hydrocolloid blister patches. They are not at all a good thing to use during a race that has wet, dirty conditions.
Okay.
Because a hydrocolloid dressing, or a blister, like those blister patches, they're made to replicate the protective environment that the skin provides. And so when you have a blister and the blister bursts, or if you lance it, poke a hole in it and squeeze out the fluid, and you put the blister patch over it, that protects the sensitive skin underneath the dermis and lets it heal. So blister patch is made to stay on for like 7 to 10 days of the life of the blister. So the adhesive in that, and the hydrocolloid, the nature of it is to absorb moisture. So it technically, like, it's a wound care product. It absorbs the exudate, or the fluid that your body is creating, and it kind of bubbles up and looks weird. And it works really well in a controlled, clean, dry environment. But when you are running a race and you put one of those on, and then you have the dirt and the wetness, and then the shifting, that adhesive stays strongly adhered to the skin, but then it clumps up into a gelatinous mess on top of tissue that has been injured, and now you can't get it off. The best you can do. Oh my God, I've seen it tear. If you see my Instagram, like, I'm gonna this time of year I start reposting my foot care stuff. Like, I have a picture of somebody where the tip of their toe actually was pulled off by the blister patch. And they don't know any better. It says blister patch. Of course you're going to put it on. And this is where you need to know your products, people.
Okay.
And so
Oh my God.
Only use those in a clean, dry after a race.
Okay.
Or I had a runner last week. Here's for every rule, there's an exception. If you have a blister that happened last week on a training run or you ran a race, and then now you have another race coming up this week, don't tear the blister patch off. It's already on, it's already protecting that skin. This is where you would tape over the blister patch in a clean, dry environment. Use a bunch of the adhesive, the Mastisol or Skin Tack. Now that blister patch and that blister that hasn't healed yet are protected from the environment, and it's not going to gum up and shift around and become a gelatinous mess and cause more tissue damage and take the tissue with it. So I think if I could get
Okay.
can just don't use them during a race. It's
Okay.
really, if you're hiking and it's kind of controlled, that's different. But yeah, just be mindful that you can really cause a lot of damage during a race by using those.
So what should I use when I get a blister in a race?
So if you get a blister during a race, here's two of the things that are really common. If it's maceration, well, either way, you're going to tape using the kinesiology type tape, because that's the one way, or stretchy lengthwise, not widthwise. You're going to take, if it's a blister, you're going to want to lance it, because you want to poke a hole in it and drain the fluid in a controlled environment, because then you're preserving the integrity of the roof of the blister. So that skin that just has a couple of holes poked in it is protecting the dermis that has the nerves and the blood vessels in it. So it's a lot less uncomfortable while you're running. And then if you have any tissue that has been compromised and you're putting tape over it, you need to protect it from the adhesive of the tape. And so this is where putting just a little dollop of zinc oxide or desitin on the roof of the blister, and then taping over that will allow for, you're protecting that blister, you're protecting the blister from becoming worse, and you're saving yourself a lot of discomfort than if you were to leave the blister alone and hope and pray that it gets better, which it won't. If that's blister, if that blister bursts on its own, what happens is the roof tears. And now you have that whole roof of the blister has torn, and now that dermis is exposed. It's a lot more painful. You got dirt in there too, so that's painful. And you can only do so much to clean that off. And then if that happens, if you have a blister that bursts and the roof is kind of torn off and you're trying to fix it during a race, see if you can tease that tissue back. You should have ideally you have like tweezers. You could pull that skin, just pull that skin and cover the blister, the skin underneath, as best you can. And you do your little dollop of desitin or antibiotic if that's all you've got. Desitin is nice. The zinc oxide is nice because it's a desiccant. It dries skin out, and so it'll absorb some of that serous fluid that the blister is creating. And then you tape over it. But ideally, you catch a blister, you got a hot spot, just take a second, a couple of minutes, and address it sooner than later.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're not saving yourself any time. Like if you ignore a blister, now the roof's going to tear off and it's going to take you 10 minutes to fix it when it would have taken you 3 minutes, it would take you maybe 4 or 5 minutes just to slap some tape on there and move on down the road.
Definitely. Okay. Wow. Okay. I've got one last question. I've just, in my little head, I've got all this tape, I've got all this adhesive, I've got this extra adhesive to make the tape stick extra more. How do you get all this off your feet at the end when they're in such a state anyway? How do you get all this stuff off without tearing your skin off at the same time?
That's a brilliant question, and it kind of will dovetail over into the damage that's caused by maceration, which is like when your tissues the skin is exposed to prolonged wetness, whether it's because of your foot or the external conditions, the top layer actually disconnects from from the layer that the blood supply is in, it kind of delaminates. That top layer starts to shift when you move. And then you'll also have those pruny wrinkles that'll happen, and the edges of the wrinkles will rub together and the skin will often tear. And then I always know that somebody has a macerated foot when they come into the aid station, when they say, it feels like I have a blister on the ball of my foot. 9 times out of 10, that macerated skin has disconnected, has been rubbing, and it feels like a blister. Ideally, the skin has not torn yet, but if it has torn, do not panic. It looks awful, but it's the same technique. You approximate the edges of the torn tissue, put a little zinc oxide, put a little of that the pre-adhesive on there and tape over it. And then especially with the macerated tissue, you want to make sure that all the wrinkles are kind of taken out. And it's usually the ball of the foot where all this is happening. But with that said, it depends on what has happened to the foot. Ideally, if you have tissue that's damaged underneath, leave the tape on.
Okay.
So you finish your race, especially if the tissue underneath, if you've had macerated tissue on the bottom of your foot that has torn, and even if you've put the zinc oxide on to protect the skin, the tape from adhering to the skin, you've created a nice protective environment for the dermis to heal because the tissue actually needs to be it doesn't need to dry out. Drying out actually makes an exposure to air, makes something take longer to heal. So what you would do is if you know you have torn tissue, you can, if you've applied the tape properly, it will stay on while that tissue underneath is healing. And so if you've got ball of the foot and you've got torn tissue underneath, just leave it on.
You
for the
basically
next
stuck your skin back on.
You've created a nice skin layer. And so, and especially with the toes too, what you can do is don't ever pull the tape off of damaged skin. Here, the technique for people who work, in wound care is if you're trying to remove tape from skin, you peel up a little bit of the tape and then you roll your finger so that you're moving the skin away from the tape. So you don't pull the tape from the skin, you move the skin from the tape, and that's the way to remove tape. But if you've put tape over compromised tissue after a race, you're better off leaving it there for a few days until it doesn't feel as tender. And so what'll happen is the edges of the tape will start kind of rolling up, and then you just kind of trim those edges off. And then over time, you'll just know when you can kind of pull that tape off. But I've had people at Western States 100, especially, where I'm just like, you can't take your shoes off until you get to the hotel. Like, I'm scared. Like, I had this, this is years ago. I had this big Russian guy come in. He's like 250 pounds. I don't know how the hell he's running the Western States. It's amazing. He comes in and he's like, sits down on the chair. Oh, my feet. I can't do the Russian accent. I wish I could. He's like, oh, my feet. I got blisters on the bottoms of them. And sure enough, he'd macerated and the whole bottom of his foot had separated. So I'm like, I can rebuild this. It's gonna kind of, anyhow. I can get you to I can tape you so you can get to the finish. It's not gonna be pretty. And so I got the edges close together and I taped over it, and then I saw him at the finish. Dude, if there'd been beer at the aid station, he'd have been drinking a beer. He's eating a burger, having a Coke. He's chatting, telling stories. His little wife was like 5 foot nothing. Like 300 to 250 pounds. And I'm like, and he gets to the finish. He goes, oh, take all that tape off. And I'm like, oh no. I'm like, where are you guys staying? And they're like, oh, we're staying in a hotel for a couple of days. And I'm like, I'm scared to take your shoes off, because his wife, there's no way she could help him.
No.
Like, and I'm like, here's what's going to happen. Like, this is one of the very few times I'm like, I'm scared I'm not even taking your shoes off. Like, you should not take your shoes off until you're in an area where you can crawl. Because what you're going to do is you're going to get back to the hotel room. You're going to take your shoes off. Your feet are going to expand, you're not going to be able to get them back in the shoes. And because he didn't have any slides like sandals that I could put his feet in, because I knew once I got his shoes off, there's no there. But he was, from the damage that was done with his feet and how compromised I mean, he didn't have any, there was no tissue integrity. He didn't have any skin on the bottom of his feet. My tape was holding his feet together. I'm like, do not take the tape off.
Yeah.
And you're gonna crawl around in the you're gonna crawl in the hotel for the next 2 days, because his wife couldn't help him. I'm just like, oh my God. So you just need to know. Yeah. So leave tape on if you put it over damaged tissue, because you're just
leave it on. Okay. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
I've got pictures, but I'm not good.
I'm very glad you had no pictures to accompany this, actually. I'm not very good with feet pictures.
Okay.
But thank you so much. I mean, that's been fascinating, and I've learned so much. And yeah, so everyone go out and get the 7th edition, 7th edition, which is now fully co-authored by Tonya Olson. All her tips, there it is. All her tips are in it. And I will also be I'll share all the links that Tonya has shared with me, both on social when I share this, and I might actually do a little article. I'll put it on the website as well,
Good.
so that everyone can click through, because I think, people need help when it comes to this.
And yeah, and you guys can you can always just message me, like on social, especially like Instagram or Facebook. I'm on Insta a little bit more, but if you direct message me, if you've got a foot care question, if you're gonna ask me a question about foot care, send me a damn photo. Like,
Don't copy me in.
Send me a picture of the blister. Send me a picture of what it is in that first message. Hey T, I've had this issue during my last race. I'll do like, I usually am pretty good at responding right away, but I'm always really interested in helping people be able to problem solve and to be able to finish what they've started and reach their goals, because foot issues are the number 2 reason of why people have to drop out of races. And number 1 is GI issues. So if I can I'm always happy to help if I can, at all possible. So this has been so fantastic.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.